You chose to work out. I didn't pick it.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. This is the Toronto East York meeting for the Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods program. It's 7 p.m. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. We'll give it 1 or 2 more minutes before we get going. Okay, it's 7:02, so I think we can get going. Hi, everyone. My name is Lillian D'Souza. I am the coordinator for engagement and special projects in the Chief Planner's Office in City Planning. I will be your host and facilitator for the meeting this evening. Before we begin, I want to inform everyone that we will be recording this meeting. So when you are sharing any comments or posting anything in the chat, please be mindful and do not include any personal identifying information within your remarks or in the chat for this meeting. I'm joined by many colleagues today, many of whom are leading the different streams of the Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods initiative. We'll be providing a presentation and we'll get to know each other a little bit better at that time. But before we begin, let's start with a land acknowledgement. The land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is within the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So this is our agenda for tonight. We'll be kicking off with a presentation by city staff. That should be about 35 or 40 minutes. This will provide an overview of the ehon initiative, including the multiplex permissions, local retail permissions, and major street permissions. After that presentation, we'll jump into a facilitated discussion and Q&A, which will be about an hour or 65 minutes. So with that, I can pass, maybe I can pass it off to Greg Ewens to kick off the presentation. So Greg, over to you.
Hey, Lillian. Thanks, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Here, I'm going to share my screen real quick. There we go. Okay, so what is expanding housing options in neighborhoods? I'm Greg Ewens. I work in city planning in the Chief Planner's Office with Lillian and with a number of my colleagues who are on the call tonight working on various pieces of the Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods work plan. So we're going to tell you a bit about what that is. So this expanding housing options in neighborhoods is intended to allow a greater variety of low-rise housing across the city to house a greater variety of individuals, families, households. The changes we're exploring will support people who live in neighborhoods, people who want to move into neighborhoods, and families who are growing in neighborhoods. If we want to have a successful, resilient, attractive city in the coming decades, these are some changes that we need to be considering. Now, this is a conversation where voices of the people who live outside of neighborhoods and even outside of the city itself have as much say as the people who live within neighborhoods. It's important for all planning matters to consider the needs of those who don't yet live in a community, but one day might. Now, Toronto likes to think of itself as a diverse, inclusive city full of opportunity, and our housing policies need to reflect that identity. And right now, in a lot of areas in the city, that's not necessarily the case. It's currently very challenging for people in many situations to find housing in the city, especially in neighborhoods. This is in part because it can be difficult to build the types of housing suited to people's needs. In July of 2020, City Council asked planning staff and staff from a number of other divisions to undertake a series of actions called Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods, or EHon. This work is intended to study, consult on, and recommend approaches to permit new forms of low-rise housing in the city's neighborhoods, shown here, sometimes called missing middle housing, from detached secondary suites like garden and laneway suites to various forms of multiplex housing, different forms of townhouses, and low-rise apartment buildings. Now, many of these may be familiar to you as they exist across the city, especially within the Toronto and East York district, where this meeting is focused tonight. Now, these building types are sometimes referred to as missing middle, though a lot of it does exist. In fact, about 30% of Toronto residents live in one form of missing middle housing or another, but it is largely missing from the type of construction underway today, figuring as about less than 1% of residential construction starts year over year in the city the last several years. Now, this is a map from the city's official plan. The city's official plan is a document that covers the entire city, and it provides land use and other direction on things such as where we grow, where we generally remain stable, where our manufacturing and employment areas are, where our parks and green spaces and ecological areas are. Now, this map shows those different areas, and there are policies that correspond to each one of them. But we're talking primarily tonight about the yellow area, the neighborhoods shown here. They take up a significant amount of land in the city when compared to any other designation. When I say neighborhoods, I mean the areas across the city where you find mostly 2-, 3-, 4-story houses, sometimes small apartments, parks, amenities, local businesses and services, schools, and other things. And Toronto's neighborhoods are a place where many of us live. They are an important part of the city's identity, of course, but they play a critical role in the function of the city. They provide housing. So why are we looking at introducing missing middle housing into the city's neighborhoods across Toronto? Well, at the provincial level, there's a range of policy documents that explicitly intend the creation of more housing and a greater range of it in the existing urban area, especially the creation of complete communities, which, in my view, certainly includes a range and mix of housing types and forms. The city's own policies in the official plan point to similar objectives, a full range of housing and choice, including within the neighborhoods, acknowledging that physical changes in the neighborhoods are intended to be gradual and fit with the existing planned character of neighborhood patterns. Now, I think it's important to talk about the type of housing that expanding housing options is intended to deliver, and that's new market rental housing. It's not housing that meets the city's definition of affordable, and it's not housing that is means tested, but it is housing that is more relatively affordable than the current options across much of the city. Yes, we need affordable housing, absolutely. And through various programs such as Housing Now, inclusionary zoning, modular housing, and others, we're advancing affordable housing. Other levels of government have a significant role to play too. The expanding housing options in neighborhoods work is one piece of a complex housing puzzle. So what's in the scope of expanding housing options? So the work we're doing comprises a number of different simultaneous work programs. Some are intended to allow new forms of housing through zoning and policy, new housing such as garden suites, such as multiplex housing, and rezoning the city's neighborhood major streets to allow for more intensification and other forms of missing middle development. We're also looking at introducing local retail and service uses, and you'll hear more about some of this tonight. We have a pilot project in the Beaches, East York, that we're looking at developing missing middle demonstration projects on city-owned properties. And we've also undertaken neighborhood change research. There's a report in November of last year on the Planning and Housing Committee agenda, which you can find on our website, that talks about neighborhood change and relative to the underlying zoning in areas across the city. We're also looking at introducing and developing best practices and how-to guides to help people navigate the system and build this housing on their properties. We're also monitoring the outcomes of this work. Garden Suites, for example, recommended a rather substantial monitoring program, not unlike the Laneway Suites monitoring work that completed in November of last year. We're also looking at identifying and resolving barriers to the creation of missing middle housing, whether those are financial, whether they're in policy or zoning, whether they're in process. And we want to incentivize low carbon development as well, sustainable development to the greatest degree we can. There was a parking review that was done over the last year, and that result concluded in, I believe, December of last year, and that effectively removed parking minimums for just about all types of missing middle housing across the city, which removes a significant barrier to the creation of this kind of housing. It doesn't mean you can't build parking, it just means you don't have to. And we're also, as part of all of this work, undertaking a capacity review of infrastructure, working with our colleagues in Toronto Water and Transportation and Engineering Services to understand infrastructure in areas where new missing middle housing would go. So what does all this look like? Well, here is an example of an area in the city, nowhere specific. You've got, a larger street, TTC bus service. You've got a number of larger residential lots, singles, semis, parks, etc., local streets. And the type of housing that we're looking to introduce through the variety of expanding housing options initiatives is shown here. In orange, you see garden suites. In purple, you see an example of multiplex housing, both new and converted buildings to provide more units. And in red, you see different forms of missing middle housing, townhouses, and low-rise apartments on main streets. And in the yellow, you see opportunities for local commercial and service uses to help support additional residents living in communities. Now, in this picture, the colored blocks here represent an increase of at least 150 new housing units. And that's of a variety of sizes, all the way from bachelor up to 3-bedroom. And that's one of the great things about this form of housing is it can accommodate a wide range of sizes and household structures. And when you turn off the highlights, you see that the housing we're looking to introduce here is very similar to the scale and type of housing that you would see in neighborhoods across the city and represents, a gradual evolution of neighborhoods, allowing more people to live in them. So to talk more about one of the types of housing you saw on that map, multiplex housing, I'll turn it over to my colleagues on the multiplex team, Chris and Deanne.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Hilbrecht, a community planner in the Toronto and East York District, and I'm here with my colleague Deanne Mighton from Urban Design to talk about multiplexes. Next slide, please. So just to begin, the multiplex study is grounded in some guiding principles which speak to equitable, diverse, and inclusive neighborhoods, Toronto's identity as a city of neighborhoods, maintaining a low-rise scale of 4 stories or less, balancing growth with a sustainability and livability lens, and facilitating multiplexes through simplified policies and processes, reduced financial barriers, and expanded permissions. And when we talk about facilitating this type of development, what we mean is that this should be possible for a regular homeowner to understand the process of adding units, and it should be clear what kind of costs one might be subject to from the city. City planning recognizes that more sophisticated developers can navigate this process, but our intent is to simplify it so you don't need to be a professional to build a multiplex or to convert an existing house into a multiplex. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about when we talk about multiplexes? Housing with 2, 3, or 4 units in a single building. This is generally rentals, but could also be small-scale condominiums. And it can be existing houses divided into multiple units, or it could be purpose-built multiplexes. Next slide, please. So multiplexes are not a new idea in Toronto, and in the Toronto and East York District in particular. This will be a very familiar form. Before the 1960s, this was a common housing type being built in neighborhoods across the city throughout its streetcar suburbs. But as new car-oriented suburbs began to develop, zoning bylaws were written to reflect their master plans, and these generally only permitted single detached houses in low-rise areas. Next slide, please. As a result, a big portion of the city's low-rise neighborhoods, about 70%, permit only single detached dwellings, limiting the areas where new multiplexes can be built. Next slide. The main goal of this study is to permit multiplexes in neighborhoods citywide. We want to move from the map on the left, which shows that they are only permitted in a small section of the city, to a city that can accommodate gentle density in all its low-rise areas. About 96% of homes in low-rise neighborhoods are located within walking distance of a TTC subway, streetcar, or bus route. And historically, even where they're permitted, the rate of multiplex development has been modest. Similarly, we expect change will be gradual and incremental while making better use of local infrastructure and amenities. So with that, I'll pass the mic to my urban design colleague, Deanne, who will talk about what this could look like.
Thanks, Chris. And hello, everyone who's out there tonight. Thanks for joining us. So how do we do this? Mostly, it's not a huge change. So what we've been calling our approach is thinking inside the box. Today, there's a typical zoning box on every lot, and you can build a house within that. You can expand your house. You can to within those setbacks, side yard, front yard, and within the height limit. What we're looking to do is to maintain that box predominantly, but allow more units within the box. Many of the boxes, sort of zoning boxes today, have a lot of capacity in them, which is where we see the larger homes in some areas. But with that, we are not getting more housing, we're just getting larger homes. So we're looking to find more flexibility within these boxes and allow more units and different structures to these physical buildings. Next slide. So we're also looking to simplify the zoning standards. Right now, we've got, we sort of have the residential zone, which permits sort of a building that is the orange building here, the orange envelope as we see on the screen, which allows 17 meters. It allows 1.5 meter side yard setbacks and a general height of 10 meters. We have a detached zone, which is where only, so RD, you're allowed to build residential detached and R zone detached. We have different zones that permit buildings of a certain scale within them. What's somewhat unfair, and I think one of the barriers we found to multiplexes in different parts of the city is the multiplex, the R multiplex zone, is actually smaller than the standard residential zones, therefore resulting in smaller buildings than what you can permit as a single family house. So we're looking to make that more even. So this is the blue box at the bottom of the screen, and we're looking to make that equivalent to the orange and green box and simplify some of our existing zoning standards so that you can build a multiplex the same size as you can build a single family house on a lot today. Next slide. We're also looking to reduce some of the financial barriers. The team is studying the financial impacts, the following fees and charges on multiplex development, parkland dedication rates, cash in lieu for parkland, development charges, and committee of adjustment fees. And we're trying to find ways to streamline and reduce the barrier to this type of housing as we go through this study. Next slide. We're also looking at balancing different priorities, making units more accessible, looking at sustainable building practices, building and unit design, making sure that they are, optimized for great living spaces. Affordability, one of the things I love about this exercise is a lot of what we've been exploring is the adaptive reuse of existing buildings. And we know that that is environmentally more sound because the existing, embodied carbon in the building by reusing much of it to build more housing out of that form, you're actually have a lower carbon footprint. And also, you're looking at sustainable building practices. Most of these buildings will be built out of timber, which have a much lower sort of carbon footprint than buildings that are built out of concrete. So there's a lot of different things we're looking at. One of the things we're grappling with in this exercise is, do we allow the footprint to remain the same on the lot and allow it to go a little higher so we get better units with better light and more usable space? Or do we look at actually keeping the height down but expanding in the back and maybe using up a bit more of the green space in the backyard where we may lose some sort of open space on that lot? So these are the things we're trying to balance as we're doing the design exercises, and we're looking forward to some feedback and people's thoughts on that. Next slide. So the proposed outcomes for the multiplex stream is an official plan policy change to allow multiplexes in all neighborhoods, recommended zoning bylaw changes, building types and permitted envelopes. We're looking at simplifying them a bit and aligning them so that the envelopes remain the same and are equal for a single family house as it is for a multiplex. And then we're looking at inputs into the city's fee structures and approval process and improvements so that there's less barriers. And through this, we've identified some areas of additional study that we're hoping to take forward to a next phase as well. I'm going to pass it on to the next group. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carola Perez-Book, and I'm also in city planning, and I'm part of the local retail and service team. I'm joined here tonight by my colleague, John Duncan. Next slide, please. So what are we talking about when we refer to local retail and service? We're talking about small-scale retail, service, and office uses that primarily serve the residents in a given area or neighborhood. And the pictures here show some examples that people might be familiar with, especially in the Toronto East York part of the city, where we see a lot of these. So we have cafes, corner stores. In some of the more suburban areas of the city, we have commercial or small commercial plazas that take the form of local retail there. And we're also talking about home-based businesses, such as some personal service shops, medical type uses, as well as home daycares. Next slide, please. And so why is this important, and what sort of area or what geographic area are we talking about? So Greg already pointed out this map and the area delineated within it, which is our neighborhoods designation under our official plan. So what the local retail and service team is proposing would also apply to the same designation, so to the neighborhoods. And why this is important is in order to create complete communities that are more walkable, and in turn, where people walk more and drive less, that contributes to sustainability. They also, local retail also helps in providing flexibility in terms of being able to adapt and help provide a diversity of services in an area, which can make it more resilient to change. And we saw this through the COVID-19 pandemic, where people did rely on local retail services more so throughout the pandemic. We also think of these as incubation spaces for small businesses that are maybe just starting out and can't afford the higher rents, or maybe don't have a lot of employees and it's just them sort of starting out. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, we've seen this type of retail and service uses decline across the city. The numbers there on the top right of the slide show that in recent decades, there's been an over 30% decline in these uses in our neighborhoods. So the map there shows, again, it shows the yellow geography of the neighborhoods that we just talked about on the previous map. But the shades of purple and blue show the density of the retail and service establishments within those neighborhoods. So the areas in the dark purple, which are sort of more or less concentrated in the former city of Toronto, are the areas where there's a higher concentration of these types of uses. And then as the colors move into the paler shades, that's where those neighborhoods have fewer and fewer types of these uses. So the reason, or some of the reasons why these have been in decline is that in the more suburban areas, a lot of the commercial plazas are being demolished for other types of uses and development, including residential. And in some cases, stores, existing stores are being converted to residential uses, like that example there from the annex from just a few years ago in the photos in the bottom left. Next slide, please. So this is an example. So this was an article that came out in the Toronto Star during the pandemic, and it highlights the story of a local corner store in the West End of the downtown. And it's been in the neighborhood for 40 plus years. And the local residents, it took the pandemic to sort of highlight how important this, or to bring to the forefront how important this use was, so that when people had to stay close to home because of the pandemic, or maybe couldn't get to or didn't want to go to larger stores, this became a very important part of their community. And so the title of the slide says the store could not be started today. And one of the reasons for this is that, or the main reason for this is that our policies don't really support these types of uses. So first we have our official plan policies, and in the official plan, new local retail and service uses are not permitted. So the policies talk about the existing uses that are allowed to remain. And new uses are only permitted on major streets and through a zoning bylaw amendment. So those are two aspects that in this case, this example is not on a major street, so it would not be permitted under the official plan. And then our zoning bylaws also do not permit non-residential uses for the most part, or these types of non-residential uses in neighborhoods. So in this case, the store, if it were to close, it would not be able to reopen, or if it converted to residential, it would be really difficult to reopen or to convert it back to non-residential uses. Next slide, please. So what we're doing to try and promote or to try and make it easier for these types of uses to locate in our neighborhoods, there's two things we're doing. So as part of our sort of phase one changes, we're proposing a change to our official plan policies. So this slide here shows what the existing policy is on the left and what the proposed policy is on the right. I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail. We are going to post this on the city's ehon project webpage for comments shortly. And so essentially under the old policy, or the current policy talks about existing uses the existing uses are permitted to remain, and new ones are only permitted on the major streets and only with the zoning bylaw amendment. And what we're proposing to do is change that so that new uses are permitted without, and they don't require a zoning bylaw amendment necessarily. And we will leave some of those, so the official plan policy or the amendment that we're proposing will set the framework to allow those uses. And then the zoning bylaw, which we're going to consult on in the next phase of our work in 2023, will provide details on the implementation. So what types of uses, as well as conditions and things like that. Next slide, please. The other change we're proposing as part of sort of our phase one bucket of changes is with respect to home-based businesses, or what are known in the zoning bylaw as home occupation. And while they are permitted across the city currently, as long as it's the principal residence of the business operator, there are a lot of limitations to what can be done in most parts of the city. So for example, in most parts of the city, you cannot have any employees working in your business, and it's quite limited. So you can see on this map, it shows the different residential zones. The R zone is the one I'm most interested in pointing out, which covers, it's the darker brown, and that applies in the former City of Toronto area. And that the R zone permissions for home occupation are currently the most permissive that exist. And so in that case, we see that you are allowed to have certain personal service shops where you can have employees and where you can have customers coming to your business. So what we're proposing to do, and we did, talk to some of our colleagues in MLS, or municipal licensing and standards, that deal with enforcement and complaints to 311 and things of that nature. And there haven't been a lot of complaints in the past, in recent years, with respect to these uses. So we really can't think of any reasons why these permissions should not apply equally across the city. So that is what we're planning as part of this proposed change that, again, it will also be posted on our webpage so people can look at it in detail, but we're proposing to equalize those home occupation permissions across the city. So they'll no longer be limited just to former City of Toronto area. Next slide, please. So the other thing we're going to be doing, but not quite yet, but part of our 2023 work, is to look at the local plazas that exist in North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke. A lot of these are zone CL, which is a commercial local zone, and they don't have any residential permissions provided for them through the zoning. And they were originally developed when the subdivisions were developed as sort of the local commercial for that area. We've succeeded in maintaining them as commercial because we don't allow residential uses there. So they never, I mean, some of them did go through processes, development applications to convert to residential, but in a lot of cases, they still exist. However, we know that some of them are falling on hard times as people look to online shopping or other types of retail. So what we are going to be looking at is for some options in ways that we might be able to support these to ensure that they remain part of the communities. And one of those is maybe now looking to introduce some limited residential permissions that would be required to also maintain the non-residential uses. So for example, maybe adding a couple stories of residential on top of the existing plaza. So that's something we're going to be looking at as part of our next phase of study as well. Next slide, please. And so finally, just to kind of summarize, as part of our phase 1 work that's going to be going forward in a report before the end of the second quarter, we have the official plan amendment to try to provide more opportunities for local retail and service uses to establish themselves more easily without zoning bylaw amendments and not just on major streets. We're going to equalize the home occupation permissions to be reflective of those that currently exist in the former City of Toronto. And then in 2023, we're going to be looking at the options for the plazas, potentially additional uses for home occupation, and also importantly, working out the details as to how we're going to implement the official plan policy for the retail and service uses. So looking at what types of uses and locations, any other performance standards, for example, limiting the size of those when they're located in neighborhoods. And we're also going to work with our colleagues in economic development to look at other potential tools we can use to encourage these types of uses. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague with the major streets teams. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brooke Marshall. I'm part of the city planning team working on the ehon project, and I will be providing the major streets presentation this evening. Next slide. So the guiding principles on the screen act to frame the review being undertaken by the major streets stream of ehon. These are very similar to the other the guiding principles of the other streams, and it is something that helps us maintain our view of what is important as we move forward in this part of the project. Next slide. So let's start by clarifying what a major street is. This is not a common term for a road, and as a result can often be confusing and easily confused with the use of the term main streets. Major streets are streets in Toronto that have been identified as a key element in Toronto's transportation network, recognized as being some of the major routes of connectivity through the city, linking neighborhoods to areas of employment or recreation, often shared with transit at the street level or running above subways or portions of LRTs that are currently under construction. These streets vary in width, both their potential future or planned width, as shown on the slide, as well as when looking at their constructed widths, the widths of the road between the curbs. Land use permissions along major streets are complicated. These streets are the location of avenue studies, are part of secondary plan areas, and portions of the city covered by site and area specific policies. Some portions are designated mixed use areas already, and the majority of the anticipated major transit station areas will be found with portions of major streets within them. Of the approximately 1,200 kilometers of major streets, only about 10%, or 250 kilometers of frontage, is designated neighborhood. Next slide. And to look at what I've just been speaking about, we pulled 3 examples of major streets in 3 different parts of the city. So this provides an example of the complexity of the physical characteristics of major streets. Each of these major streets has a planned width or right-of-way of 27 meters, but each has a different constructed width or the distance from curb to curb. And as a result, the feel and character and how development has occurred on either side of the street is quite different. Next slide. As we pull together the physical character, the policy landscape, and the history of development along these major streets, the picture can be quite complex. Add to that the size of lots along the major streets and the variability of lot frontages, so directly fronting, having a rear frontage, flanking, or having an irregular lot. The question of which form and how much development is appropriate along major streets becomes complicated. Next slide. The Major Streets team is working on several areas of analysis to find themes and common characteristics for the major streets designated neighborhoods across the city. As well, we are watching the development of recommendations from the multiplex and local retail teams who are setting the baseline for new permissions within the neighborhoods. Between what is being proposed by those ehon teams and the permissions for mixed use areas along major streets is a gap that our team is working to address. The gap between 4-unit low-rise multiplexes and mid-rise buildings as set out in mid-rise guidelines is where our residential permissions are expected to fit. Similarly, the gap between local retail, like corner stores, and mixed-use retail or plaza shopping areas will be where we're looking to find solutions to the question of how much additional retail or other non-residential uses can and should be permitted along major streets. Next slide, please. And as we move forward, we'll be undertaking further analysis to complete the identification of major streets characteristics, review the policy landscape, undertake financial analysis to consider the opportunities for homeowner-initiated intensification in the major streets context. We're going to be collaborating with the multiplex and local commercial teams. And though the date is wrong on this, I'm participating in roundtable consultations and additional consultations throughout the rest of the project. We're also aiming to bring an interim report to the Planning and Housing Committee towards the end of Q2 in 2022. Thank you.
My set of slides. Hi, everyone. Again, it's Lillian. As the coordinator of engagement in the Chief Planner's Office, I am helping to coordinate engagement on ehon. So if you're interested in participating and sharing your thoughts with us, the next few slides are for you. So on the next slide, we have really tried to capture a toolbox of different ways we are engaging on ehon. We know that we're trying to reach the broadest number of voices that we can as part of this process, people who live in neighborhoods today, people who don't live in neighborhoods but may want to one day, and also the general communities who live outside of Toronto as well, because what happens in Toronto's neighborhoods does impact communities outside of Toronto as well. So to that end, we have a range of techniques we're using. So we're consulting with industry, missing middle developers, planners who work in this type of missing middle type of housing. We're engaging youth and children. We have information campaigns, videos, and an e-update list to get the word out. You can sign up for our e-updates on our website, toronto.ca/ehon. We also have a range of stakeholder meetings that we do. Those include meetings with grassroots neighborhoods groups, as well as residents associations. And we have the ehon roundtable, which I will share more about in a subsequent slide. So on the next slide, This summarizes the engagement we have done so far. The engagement has remained mostly virtual, and that has really helped us broaden the number of people we have reached through this. So, we have about 65 attendees in the room with us today, and we've done a district roadshow where we've had a comparable number of attendees. So we really try to get the virtual, open up the virtual rooms as much as we can, and get people in so we can have these conversations. In addition to that, in the fall, we had a multiplex housing survey that was very successful. We had about 7,700 responses from across the city. At that time as well, we wrapped up the consultation on the Garden Suites program as part of ehon. So we had an explainer video that you can still find on YouTube, and an online comment form. Our e-updates list continues to send out updates on opportunities to engage, upcoming planning reports at Planning and Housing Committee and City Council. We've also been streamlining engagement events because we know that there is a lot of consultation happening right now, and there's a lot of consultation fatigue. So in addition to ehon-specific events, we also pop up in other places, such as the engagement on Our Plan Toronto, which is the Municipal Comprehensive Review. And if there's any meetings that are hosted by local residents associations, we also try to join those. In February, we did a number of ward-based community meetings just to have conversations at the local level. And on the next slide, this provides a bit more background and information on the ehon Roundtable. This is something new we are trying as part of the consultation program, and it's a representative advisory body that is comprised of a range of interests in the missing middle conversation. So these include academics, policy professionals, financial analysts, representatives of residents associations, but they also the table also includes a number of community-based organizations who represent communities that are not often represented in the planning process. So these include youth, racialized communities, newcomers to Toronto, Indigenous communities as well. And this helps city planning gain the perspectives of people who have been historically excluded from Toronto's neighborhoods. All of these diverse opinions are brought into a single action-oriented conversation. They are not a decision-making body. They provide advice to staff on policy ideas, draft amendments, and on the engagement strategy. And in this way, they are supporting our equity-based outreach and engagement. And on the next slide, we have the summary of April consultation. This is the beginning of a number of meetings we'll be holding. There's lots of opportunities to engage with us. And this today wraps up our district-wide meetings that we've held through April. But next week, if you wish to continue the conversation on multiplexes and local commercial uses, we have 2 meetings, one offered in the daytime and one offered in the evening. So you can pick the one that works best for you. The ehon Roundtable will continue to meet monthly, and at the end of the month, they'll be commenting or looking at the major streets work. We've done a Reddit AMA, which was a lot of fun. And at the end of April, we're also looking to hold a Twitter Spaces. So please do join us for that. And if you have any tips on how to run a Twitter Space, let me know, because that'll be our first one. Yeah, so that sums up April consultation. Sign up for our e-updates if you want to know about future engagement opportunities. Thanks, Greg. Over to you.
Thanks, Lily. So just to finish it up here, and thanks to all my colleagues for presenting all the great work they've been doing over the past year and a bit. So this, in summary, this policy at both the local and provincial levels, it supports what we're looking at doing to expand housing options across the city. And the forms that we're looking at, as you saw in the diagram earlier, are similar in a lot of ways to the form and scale of housing you can already build in neighborhoods, but they provide a lot more variety in terms of housing options. And there's a series of reports we're presenting on this. There was a report in February on Garden Suites, a report that was approved by council. There were other reports, a series of them over the last year. You can read all of those on our website, which I'll put up in a second. And there'll be further reports sequentially through this work leading up to the election and then into 2023. This is one part of our overall housing conversation. So, you know, there's missing middle housing is just one piece of housing in the city, but this is an important conversation to have. And this is really a medium to long-term initiative. You know, the level of change that may materialize in the short term is relatively limited. And so, you know, we see this as a medium to long-term type initiative. Looking ahead, we'll have reports on multiplex housing and local commercial uses this year before the election break in July. There'll be consultation events held throughout the year, next several months especially. As I mentioned, we're working on how-to guides and best practices for garden and laneway suites. We'll be continuing on with the roundtable work. And in 2023, we'll be bringing forward recommendations on further official plan amendments and the major street rezoning work, as well as other things we've been working on. So stay in touch. Check out the website, toronto.ca/EHON. Sign up for e-updates. You can also email us your comments or give us a call anytime you like. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out to the meeting tonight. I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts, and I appreciate all the activity in the chat. Back to you, Lillian. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Great. So thanks, everyone, for the great presentation. We're at 7:45, so we have about 45 minutes for Q&A. I think we can get through those fairly quickly. If you want to raise your hand, there's a little palm sign at the bottom right of your screen, so you can click that button to raise your hand. We have a number of people who have raised their hands already. I do not pick the order of speakers. It just comes up as you raise your hand. So we'll kind of go back and forth between the chat and the live speakers. So Alina, let's begin with you. You have your hand raised. I will be unmuting you. Please go ahead. Yes, hi, we can hear you.
Hi, so my name is Elena. I'd just like to say that I think this is a really exciting proposal and opportunity for the city. We need more housing in the city, and this is a way to build that housing on the land that is already available to us. But my question is on development charges. So I know you had mentioned that you're looking at ways to make sure that we don't put up barriers to this type of gentle density, but the city is also proposing to increase development charges by nearly 50%. So can you address how to kind of balance those two items? Because I'm concerned that the increased development charges will prevent development.
Great, thank you so much for that great question, Alina. Greg, can you provide some perspective on that?
Sure, I agree. It's a great question. And so one of the things we're doing, and actually we just did some work last week on the multiplex initiative, where working with the Urban Land Institute, we held a workshop that looked at the financial viability of different types of multiplex housing construction across the city, both new construction and conversions. And part of that conversation centered on the barrier that's created, especially to the creation of rental housing by development charges. So while I'm aware that the city has put out the recommended changes to DCs earlier this week, you know, one of the things that we're going to talk about in these reports is opportunities to, you know, support and I'll say financially incentivize the creation of missing middle housing. What I think we want to create is a supportive regulatory environment for this type of housing. So that includes fees and process and bylaws and other regulations. So we'll be making those recommendations. I mean, the city has the ability to change and amend its development charges from time to time. A good example with the laneway suites work, you know, it wasn't in the middle of a development charge review cycle, but the recommendations we made as part of that work ended up basically waiving DCs entirely for laneway suites as you build them. So look for discussion on that in the final report. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yep, and just to add to that, Greg, the DCs were just the draft DCs were just released a few days ago, so they're being consulted on right now. So you can share your thoughts with the city through that consultation process as well. Okay, so let's jump into the chat for a bit. There are lots of questions around multiplexes. So Deanne and Chris, these questions will be for you. So what does multiplexes look like in the RS zone? And there's also a question around the zones where multiplexes are already permitted. So we're not looking at rezoning any of those R zones exactly. So can you clarify a bit more about where the permissions will apply?
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to say is they should look like the existing houses next door, or you know, and that's the idea. We're not trying to look at an envelope that is excessively bigger, or what we're trying to do is make it even. Right now, multiplexes are this envelope for multiplexes is smaller than what it is for a single family house. And what we're trying to do is make the scale of that building even, but allow more units to be in that building. So that's what we're looking to do. So it should not look out of scale. You know, when you're in the downtown core, you walk by many houses constantly, and you can't tell the difference between multiplexes and single family houses. So that is the idea, but for the four other parts of the city.
Great. Anything else to add, Chris, or can we move on? Okay. Okay, great. There's also a few questions in the chat around parking spots and the parking requirements specifically for multiplexes. Parking is an issue in some areas, or some people in the chat feel like zero parking should be required. So any thoughts on the proposed standards for parking as part of your work for multiplexes?
We're not currently looking at expanding the parking requirements for more units. So we're looking at if there's existing parking on site, we're looking at maintaining it, but we're not looking at adding a parking requirement for added units in line with the new bylaw.
Great.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just add to that, because I think there was also a parking related question in the chat about whether multiplexes would create demand for more parking, and how we would protect the tree canopy and other features based on that. And I think there's still provisions within the bylaw, or there will still be provisions in the proposed bylaw to protect for soft landscaping, setbacks, other features. So that can be used to control the number of parking spaces on a lot without having to provide for minimum parking requirements for multiplexes.
Great, thanks so much, Chris.
Just to expand on that, that is one thing we are looking at, is maintaining the existing sort of soft landscaping provisions with this. So we recognize the importance of the trees and the landscaping to the character of a neighborhood, and we're not looking to change or alter that in any drastic way. We want the green to stay, and we want to encourage new trees wherever possible.
Perfect, thank you. Let's go to a live question. Bilal, I am unmuting you. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Hi, my name is Bilal, and first off, I'm really excited to see the set of reforms that you're proposing. I look forward to seeing them come through to, and seeing your first report come through to Planning and Housing Committee. I have two questions. One of them is about the thinking inside the box piece that you had on a slide over there. And specifically, like, is this box also going to be applied to neighborhoods that usually only have, like, say, single floor detached homes? And because not a lot of multiplexes can fit in kind of that box, like, are you exploring increasing that box in those instances? And the other question that I have is for neighborhoods that are mostly dominated by, say, low-rise apartments, is the ehon exploring, like, an ability for neighborhoods to either be redesignated into apartment neighborhoods or to allow some forms of mid-rise along main streets? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bilal, for those questions. Yeah, Deanne for the first part, and maybe Greg on the redesignation.
So a lot of the time, even though you see sort of single level bungalows in neighborhoods, the zoning box is actually much bigger and taller, and we haven't seen people sort of maximize what they're permitted in their existing sort of envelope. We're seeing it a bit more with the rebuilds of some bigger homes. But quite honestly, what we're noticing in some of the neighborhoods, especially some of the areas out in Scarborough, is that much of that box is left unused. So that's why we say work within the box, because we have somewhat empty boxes. So that's what we're looking to do, is to create a bit more flexibility within that box in terms of what can go in it, but also fill it up a little bit more.
Great, thanks.
Sorry about that, Lillian. With regards to opportunities on major streets, there's definitely an interest in looking at those walk-up apartments, more units per opportunity than, say, what is being proposed within the neighborhoods at the moment by the multiplex team. But we're looking to not necessarily automatically move to mid-rise as a default, or looking to have, say, mixed use be the automatic change that goes along all major streets areas. So that's why we're taking this opportunity to look at the variability and the opportunities and ways of reflecting what's currently on the ground in various neighborhoods and portions of the city, to really be able to find something that's a reasonable fit that also helps to increase the number of units available.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's jump into the chat, and these questions are related to retail uses. So Carola and John, these are for you. So there's a question around the small retail uses and how the bylaw does not distinguish between a cafe and a restaurant. So what would be the impacts of, a restaurant which could be more disruptive to local neighbors versus a cafe, and how are we going to control for that in the bylaw?
Thanks, Lillian. Yeah, that's a good question. It is true that under the zoning bylaw definitions, a cafe and a restaurant would both likely be classified as an eating establishment or a takeout eating establishment, depending on how many seats it had. So that is true, but there are other ways that we can sort of distinguish between the type of cafe or restaurant that would be appropriate in a neighborhood and those that wouldn't be. So I'm going to let John speak to some of the ways in which we can do that.
So as Gorilla mentioned, there are some ways to distinguish sort of between and limit the sort of impact of restaurant or cafe uses within a neighborhood. That could include limitations on the amount of floor area within kind of any particular unit, or limitations on patio uses, and various other aspects within sort of a cafe type use. In addition to that, we can also look at where within the neighborhood any of these retail or service uses might be expanded. They wouldn't necessarily be on all properties within the neighborhood. As Rick mentioned, major streets are different as well, and they may have some different opportunities than within a local street, as may corners within those local areas.
Okay, great. Great. Thanks so much, John and Carola. Let's jump into another live question from Jacob. So Jacob, I will be unmuting you. Please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thanks for this presentation. It's great. It's great to see us, adopting things that we know to be worldwide best practice for how to plan and develop a city. I'm under 30. I'm a renter. A lot of these neighborhoods, I grew up in a single family neighborhood, and I can't even imagine being able to, even live near my parents these days, which I think everyone would like to at least have the option to. I know not everyone wants to live so close to their parents, but some people do. I wanted to ask, my parents, they're getting older now, and they're looking to downsize at some point, but there's not really many options beyond, a large single family home with multiple staircases just to get to the entrance, having to shovel snow off the walkway, and so how would expanding housing options in neighborhoods help people like my parents stay in their communities as they age in a safe manner, and stay near their friends and family instead of having to, either stay in a place with many stairs, which might not be so conducive to aging, or moving completely away from their communities that they've, grown to love and contribute to.
Great. Oh, thank you so much, Jacob, for that great question and for also sharing your experience with us. Really appreciate that. Deanne, maybe you might want to kick off the response here.
The most exciting things about multiplexes is our ability to sort of think of housing differently. Think of the space, and look at, okay, can they turn their main floor into an accessible apartment? Can there be a unit above? Could it be a garden suite? Can you have multi-generational living on one site? Is there an income supplement if someone in the family doesn't want to live on the site? I think the design possibilities are really endless, and looking at these different configurations, we've been having a lot of fun sort of playing within the box, right? And seeing how many units we can design and lay out, and I'm hoping that at another phase we can bring some of these concepts out to people so it's a bit more visual. But one thing we are looking at is the aging population who don't want to leave their neighborhood, and maybe having another family member move in, but in a separate unit where you can live independently and still be there to support each other. So these are things we've been discussing and working through with some of our design concepts. And it's really about flexibility, right? So what we are trying to create more flexible models within the existing sort of forms that we have, or within the existing envelope we have in the neighborhood. So I think this is the fun part going forward.
Great, thanks, Deanne. All right, 8:01, so we have about 30 minutes. So we have a number of questions in the chat. So here's one on FSI. So Greg, maybe I'll pass this on to you. Are we looking at things like FSI and so what is the question here? A lot of the current multiplex zoning you showed on a previous slide is currently zoned R, but has a really low FSI, which functionally prohibits anything other than detached homes. So maybe Greg and the multiplex team can tag team here, but Greg could kick off the answer.
Sure, I'll just, so, I mean, FSI is an interesting zoning provision. I think in the case of multiplex housing, it's a provision that gets used in a punitive way, like you said, to prevent the creation of multi-unit housing in some cases. I think it's a very limited use when it comes to low-rise housing in terms of creating housing that achieves the objectives people are interested in. I can see from the chat and these other meetings, people want to make sure there's soft landscaping and space for trees. They want to make sure, that the building has a certain footprint or depth or size. FSI doesn't help any of that. If you have setbacks and height and a soft landscaping requirement, that ensures that you get a building that's built within an envelope, and we're determining what that envelope is. How much building actually goes in that envelope, is it can be a single unit or it can be multiple units. Now, we talked about FSI in a report we wrote in February. So if you want more information, have a look at that. But I think, there's an opportunity, especially within multiplex housing, to flip things around and use FSI, to help incentivize the creation of multiplex housing. And that is something that we may be considering. And maybe Chris or Deanne, you could add briefly to that.
I'm going to jump in again. In Vancouver, one of the things we have been looking at is as they add units, they add FSI. So it looks at sort of optimizing those envelopes. In that case, you get 4 units, and you can go up to a 1.2 FSI, where some less units get less, which has an environmental implication, because everything we build has a carbon footprint. So we're actually sort of instead of just getting a huge house on a lot, we're sort of saying that larger building should accommodate more people, and that we're encouraging it through FSI. So I actually really like the Vancouver model, and we'll continue to study it. and hopefully move forward on it.
Great, thank you so much. Let's go to another live question from Richard. Richard, I'm unmuting you. Yep, you're unmuted.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard McFarland. I come from a long road, especially when it starts with Metro Toronto Planning Department and then continues on with the City Planning Department. I've been an employee of the city for over 30 years and started with chief planners going back to Bob Millward and continuing on John Gartner, David Gurin from New York City, John Livy, who created livable cities, folks. You remember that. And housing intensification. John Livy coined that phrase in the 1990s. Main streets, John Livy did. He hired a lot of contract city planners to do the official plan and the plan review. So I go back a long way inside and outside. And I'm with the Oriole Park Ratepayers Association, Yonge and Eglinton. We're currently grappling with Canada Square. And every time we turn around, official plan amendment 405 bites us. As you can see, 9 condominiums or more are contemplated in the Don Mills Winford area alone. Now you take into consideration the current zoning and you add, I'd say easily over 12,000 inhabitants within I'd say only about a quarter mile. You've got a huge impact in density and problems. What I'd like to see the city planners do, and I know Greg Lintern because he took over from Jennifer Keesmaat, who I invited incidentally to be the guest speaker of the Oriole Park Association annual meeting in 2012. I was the first person to invite Jennifer Keesmaat, and she's the one that gave you the round table idea, I am sure, because a lot of her round tables were public engagement. But anyway, my thoughts are, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but every time we look at planning and development, we always have a shortage in recreational facilities, a shortage in park space, a shortage in community centers, in daycare centers, and we're grappling with that currently at Canada Square. And it always seems as if there's never enough facilities and infrastructure. Now, what you're saying, and I think it's so good, is you're allowing for some infill. But what I see is in the Chaplin area, for instance, in Yonge and Eglinton, I see a lot of tall square box designed houses, and we go edge to edge. The footprint is overwhelming and out of scale to the lot size. How is your housing initiative and the infill going to control the zoning? Because what I was fighting was the peak roof and lowering the nanny suite. Because everyone said, well, we're going to go 3 stories high and the nanny suite. How are you going to? And someone said you can't legislate.
Okay, Richard, thank you. I think we got the gist of your question, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate the insight as well that you provided. All right, so we have a question here around neighborhood amenities, infrastructure. So I know, Greg, we've been talking to other divisions as part of this work. Maybe, Greg, you can start us off, and Deanne as well, if you want to jump in.
Sure, yeah, just as part of this work, you know, as you know, when city staff are working on an initiative like this, you know, we're in touch with other divisions, whether it's, you know, our staff and strategic initiatives that are looking at, you know, the provision of amenity spaces, whether it's parks, whether it's, you know, transportation, engineering, Toronto Water, you know, both hard and soft services that are important to support neighborhoods. I think part of the, you know, the appealing thing about expanding housing options, and you touched on it in your comment, was, you know, that we're, you know, introducing infill into neighborhoods to make better use, more efficient use of existing spaces, whether it's parks, schools, amenities. And we've been having conversations with, you know, the groups that are responsible for these places, including the school boards. So over to you, Deanne.
I also just want to jump in that we're trying to take some of the pressure off of those hotspots too, by not allowing any sort of infill in the neighborhoods. They have really overheated some of the centers in the downtown and the waterfront where I work, and we've seen areas that have, you know, have approvals that far exceed their capacity. West Donlands is a great example where we planned it for a certain population and it's currently approved for 40% more, though we don't have 40% more amenity, and we're trying to figure that out. So by opening up some of the lands in the neighborhoods, by allowing this gentle density, we're hoping to take the pressure off of some of those places and spread the growth out more evenly. So I think this is what's exciting about this initiative. I think there's also a huge environmental implication of that, because a lot of what's being built right now is sort of super talls and tall, which have very intensive carbon footprints. And what this allows us to do is to develop in a way that is more environmentally sensitive out of wood and timber. And some of the work we're doing with U of T on that right now in terms of embodied carbon and operating carbon is a 4-story multiplex building has less than half or equivalent of half of the carbon impact of sort of an equivalent square footage or square meter in a high-rise condominium. So I think there's multiple benefits to this program, and it is aimed at trying to make things a bit more even across the city and also respond to some of our environmental constraints.
Thanks, Leanne, for that. And actually, on the environmental piece, there was another question in the chat around green roofs. So I'm wondering whether this has been a part of some considerations for multiplex work, knowing that you're looking at the environmental angle as well. Or if anyone else is looking at green roofs as part of their work, but maybe multiplexes can start off.
The regulations do encourage it. We don't require it. So like any house, you can have a green roof. We hope you have a green roof. We'd love it if you did, especially if you had a flat roof. We'd even love some solar panels. So we encourage it in the policies and the draft policies we're writing, but we don't force anyone to do it.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's jump into another live question from Jordan. Jordan, you're being unmuted. If you're unmuted, go ahead.
I just wanted to say before anything else, I just want to give you all a shout out for all the hard work, the consultations you're doing. Like it's not easy, and thank you so much for all the hard work you're doing to help make Toronto amazing. So I'm gonna declare my bias super quick. I live in a low-rise apartment building. It's one of those buildings that can't be built. I love it. I've lived here 12 years. I'm so happy to live here. So I do have, like this kind of housing is for me. I'm a millennial. This is like the last affordable housing for workers like me. My question is, and this might be my own ignorance speaking, is this as of right? Is this plan the options are? Is it as of right zoning? Is this like the plan to kind of just allow to reduce the soft costs, the consultation costs, and make it easier to build this kind of housing?
Awesome. Okay, thanks, Jordan, and thanks for the enthusiastic support. We love it. I really appreciate your words. Okay, as of right zoning, yes, it is as of right zoning, but maybe I'll ask the teams to comment further. Greg, yeah, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks again for the question and the comments. That what we're looking at is as of right zoning, similar to what we recommended with laneway suites and with garden suites, allowing people to build the buildings by submitting a building permit as opposed to having to amend the bylaw or necessarily going to the Committee of Adjustment, trying to remove process and cost from the equation to allow people to build this type of housing faster.
Great, short and sweet. Thanks, Greg. Okay, let's go to another live question from David. David, you're being unmuted.
Share similar sentiments to the previous speaker. Thanks for doing all this important work during the consultation. I don't currently live in an apartment like that, but I used to. It was a series of duplexes in Parkdale that were on a piece of property that used to be one single mansion and now housed about 20, 30 households, so it was great. My main question is around I am really excited about the retail piece of this and looking at integrating retail back into residential neighborhoods in a way, and wondering if there are any stats or numbers around, like I realize some people have questions about parking, if those types of businesses rely on drivers, or if they actually help diminish the reliance on cars to get around and do basic errands through the city.
Yeah, so thanks. That's a really important question. I think the intention here is to obviously reduce the number of automobile trips that people are taking. So to encourage walking, um, and to attract customers from the local area, so that is possible. And for the most part, we're talking about retail and service that is, as we mentioned, small scale, so that it's not going to be a draw to people from outside the neighborhood that would maybe take more trips by car. I'm not sure, John, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Covered it off fairly well there, Corolla. Again, yeah, it's a lot of this is really local serving retail. That doesn't mean that those are the only people who will ever go there, but making it sort of more widely available within walking distance is really a critical piece here that we're looking at. And yeah, throughout this as well, sort of the set of permissions, looking at retail services and that kind of thing, so that we really are trying to achieve that sort of 15-minute city idea.
Thank you both for those responses, and to David for the question. Mary, we're going to go over to you for a question. So you're being unmuted, and I can let you know when you're unmuted. You may have to accept a request to be unmuted, so I'm going to try again. Okay, maybe we'll come back to Mary. Oh no, Mary's unmuted. Okay, go ahead, Mary.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I wanted to get quite specific because you're speaking with the Toronto East York area, and as you are aware, many of us are already zoned R. So we have on our streets existing today 2, 3, and 4 unit houses. Every kind of what you call missing middle houses exists on our street presently. So can we assume, therefore, that you will not be doing any rezoning in the R districts?
Okay, thank you, Mary, for that straightforward question. Greg or Deanne? I'm not sure. Greg, yeah.
Just in case you won't let me ask a follow-up question, if the answer is yes, you are planning on rezoning us, I'd like to know specifically what kinds of things you're planning on rezoning.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Thank you. Greg?
So I think, you know, while areas that are zoned R and permit a lot of the different types of missing middle housing that we talked about exist, you know, a lot of Toronto and East York, I think it's important to note that what we're trying to do with this work is also to, you know, reduce barriers in the existing zoning where these buildings are already permitted to have them built. So, you know, well, like you said, there are contexts across Toronto and East York that have multiplex housing, a variety of other missing middle housing. If we do look at changes to the R zone, and that's certainly something we're considering, it's to make it easier to build missing middle housing that is already a permitted use. For if there's any specifics, perhaps Deanne or Chris might be able to add to that.
Sure. Or Deanne, go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris. No, go. I've spoken lots.
Sure. I mean, so one of the examples that was shown in the presentation was looking at the maximum building depth, for example, of a multiplex. I think in the R zone, the multiplex building depth is constrained to 14 meters instead of 17 meters, where you can build a detached house that's 17 meters deep, but you can't build a multiplex 17 meters deep. We're looking at simplifying and harmonizing some of these pieces. There's other standards that have been identified in some of the ehon reports, such as the requirement that a building not have more than one front entrance. We're looking at, is that still a relevant requirement when you want to give people safe and dignified access to their housing? So there will be various performance standards that will be looked at that we're looking at harmonizing citywide, with the ultimate goal of permitting at a minimum 4 units on a lot in all residential areas.
Okay, thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes left, and we have a few speakers in the queue, so let's try to go through them fairly quickly. So I will request the upcoming speakers to limit their questions to one and to keep them fairly brief. So Richard, over to you. Richard, I think you've already gone before, so let's just give someone else an opportunity. Larissa, you're being unmuted right now. Yep, go ahead.
One question, but I'm new to this process, and so thank you for putting this together. I have two questions, but the first one's short. My question is, where in the city is there the most missing middle housing, and what's being done to address those areas that can accept the density increase? And my second question is specific to the area that I reside in. I live in Rosedale Summerhill. I've learned recently that we were supposed to have a secondary plan done for our area that was approved, that was started the discussion many years ago, 6 to 10 years ago. City Council has directed you to do this. So when can I expect to see that for my area? You know, especially as it relates to these new zoning changes and how, you know, it seems like putting the cart before the horse. Like, why isn't the secondary plan being completed before these zoning changes are being done? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Larissa, for those questions. Maybe I'll start off with Chris, if you want to jump in on the first one about the where in the city is the most missing middle housing. And then the second one about secondary plans, yeah, we'll hold off on that for now. But Chris, go ahead.
Sure. So I think according to the most recent census, if you look at sort of missing middle housing forms as a percentage of the housing stock, it's the ward Davenport in the west end of the city.
Okay.
And just to jump in on the second part, there's a secondary plan work ongoing in a certain area. I'd recommend that you reach out to the staff that are working on that. If you want to contact us after the meeting, I can put you in touch with the staff who are working on it, and they can give you a sense of timing. Generally, though, why we're looking at this work across the city is because council directed us to do that back in July 2020. So that's the scope of the work, and such as it has to consider relevant policies and bylaws in different areas of the city. Final reports will do that to the degree necessary. But reach out to us, and I'll connect you with the staff that are working on that specific study. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, Jack, let's go to you. I'm unmuting you right now, so you should be unmuted in a second. You may have to accept the request to be unmuted. So I'm going to try again. Okay, maybe we'll come back to Jack. Oh no, I always say that and then you get unmuted. All right, Jack, go ahead.
8, my wife and I bought a house in South Parkdale, big old mansion with 6 non-legal units in it. They were recognized with the city. They weren't up to code. That took 3 years to fix. Then we started to add 3 more apartments, but we didn't have enough money. So we had to wait and go through a committee of adjustments and a whole process to get 1 apartment added at a time with waits in between. I'm now 72 and finished this year. I'm way older than I thought I'd be. The development charges on adding apartments to single residential buildings just totally get in the way. They were meant for condo developers. They weren't meant for houses. Can we get rid of them?
Great. Thank you so much, Jack, for sharing that story with us as well. DCs, guys, are we getting rid of them for multiplexes or any missing middle?
Well, and thanks, Jack. Nice to see you here. Well, like I said earlier, we're looking at ways in which we can create a financially supportive environment for this type of housing, whether that's through process or through the way in which these buildings can be constructed to zoning, and also through fees and charges. So, I would encourage, if you have thoughts on development charges, I would encourage you to participate in the city's consultation on DCs. I think we can drop a link to that in the chat. So that's what I would recommend. But thanks again, Jack.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Ian next. Ian, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead.
Very much. Yeah, I'm. First of all, I appreciate the presentation. Thank you. I've learned a lot this evening about your plans, and I think they've clarified a few things for me. What was striking to me in all of your developments was that or all of your maps that showed that the tradition, and this is a simplification, but typically I believe, and I'm paraphrasing. So what I'm understanding then is that you're trying to bring the other areas of the city up to the old city of Toronto in terms of the mix of housing types that exist in neighborhoods. I hope that's an accurate statement. First of all, I'm going to say that. So the second part of my question then would be, if I wonder if the city has any data on how many units could be added in those neighborhoods that currently do not permit multiplexes or low-rise development or all of those things. How many additional units could we anticipate adding in those neighborhoods that don't currently have those permissions that would really provide for more equitable density spread across the city as opposed to in the old city of Toronto?
Great, thank you, Ian. Craig?
It's a good question. I'll try to answer this quickly as I can. So it's tricky to estimate, what kind of uptake these permissions would get. We don't know exactly what the permissions recommended permissions are going to be yet, but hypothetically speaking, we can look at areas where missing middle housing is already permitted in the R zone, for instance. And what we did is we looked at areas in Toronto and East York that have more permissive zoning compared to other areas of the city over, I believe, a 7.5-year period from 2011 to 2018. And we looked at building permit data, and the data showed that in areas where you have more permissive zoning, you get a lot more creation of additional units through building permit activity than you do in areas that have less permissive zoning. So in areas that are zoned RD and RS, where you can only generally build a detached house, semi-detached house, for instance, you were getting reconstruction of the existing houses. Whereas in the R zone, the RM zone, areas that permit more housing types, you were getting creation of both replacement of the unit that was removed and additional housing. So over that period of time, there were several thousand units created within that area. Now, if you extrapolate that to the rest of the city, and you factor in the reality that there may be more demand for this housing now, and we're trying to create a more supportive environment from a regulatory and fee and financial environment to create it, it really depends. I think various neighborhoods will see different levels of uptake over time for a variety of reasons. But I think there's a great opportunity to create a lot of new housing and a great variety through this work in neighborhoods across the city. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Greg. We have 3 minutes left and 3 speakers, so we're going to try to get to this quickly. Colleen, you're next. Please go ahead. Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm currently a renter at Yonge and Eglinton in one of the towers that I guess we've heard a little bit about tonight already. But I know that as you go north and west, there's a lot of great duplexes and low-rise apartments there, and I think it's a really great community with a lot of families. One thing I think about is I work at a hospital, and I'm lucky enough to live walking distance, but a lot of my colleagues commute in actually from outside of the city because they have families, and it's really tough to find 2-bedroom places for families in the city. And I think something like this can be a really big benefit. I was wondering, you talked a little bit about doing some environmental calculations. Is it possible to take into account this sort of sprawl and commuting in that people have, rather than maybe some of the more obvious things like the landscaping and the building materials and things? Or is that something that you can take into account?
I can
Thanks,
mention it
Colleen.
to our colleagues
Yeah,
at U of T, who are helping us with the carbon study and see if they can figure out a calculation. We haven't put that into kind of our modeling work. We've been just looking at building materials, but I think this is a great question and something we can take back for sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. Okay, Andrew, you're next. Go ahead. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Wonderful, thanks. First, I just wanted to say I appreciate all the work you're doing. It gives this later 30s engineer hope that I might someday be able to afford to sleep above ground in East York. I'm the kind of guy, I grew up, like some people, in a newer suburb where every house looked like mine, most faces looked like mine, and even felt like we all went to the same church. But what I really loved was when I finally got to high school in an area that had more different people from different places, different homes, identities, and lives. And this is kind of what appealed to me about Toronto most, which used to be really proud to say that it was the most diverse city in the world. As I've gotten into the housing debate, I feel like I really am seeing that that's far from the case, and that we right now only allow homes of a certain established character in an area, and that has a lot of knock-on consequences for what other kinds of characters can grow and thrive and be welcomed. So I want to know what ehon can do to help end appeals to established character in neighborhoods as guiding its way forward, because we know that Toronto, we are a multitude of characters, and we don't want to just be stuck in the ways of old, but welcoming ways of new. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that excellent question. Greg, I know we're looking at terms such as character, fit, prevailing in our review of neighborhood policies. Can you comment a bit further on that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a great question. We are looking at those terms, whether or not terms such as character and fit and prevailing, are useful in guiding low-rise housing in the future. And so that's definitely the focus of some of the amendments we're looking to make to the official plan through this process. To, like I said, create a more supportive environment for this type of housing through policy and among many other ways. I think that's a great question, and we'll have a lot more to say on that as time goes on. It's an important piece of this.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, it's 8:31, so we might extend the meeting for a few more minutes just so we can hear from everyone. We have one more speaker only, and then we can quickly wrap up. So, Empa, you're next. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great.
Go ahead.
So first off, I just want to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it, and I also appreciate y'all going over for us. My question is on the more education and outreach component of this conversation. I think I've had conversations with people who, they hear what we've been discussing tonight and are a little afraid maybe of what that will do to their neighborhood, its character. They haven't really been able to envision themselves in the new sort of ways that we're approaching housing within our cities, right? I think people find it difficult to see how by creating more variety of construction, we can actually do more to preserve our neighborhoods, to preserve the characters, and do more to allow, people to stay within their own communities. So I was curious to see what kind of education and outreach strategies are being considered, not just for people who are a little bit scared, but also for younger people who, feel really disillusioned and don't really know that these ideas can help them and are coming in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Empa, for that great question. I can actually comment on this a little bit as I coordinate the engagement for the project. That is such an important point that you raised, the education and outreach part of it. So what does missing middle actually look like, and what are the benefits of this? Through the spring, we are going to be ramping up engagement right up until the elections, when we do have to stop engaging, and then we'll pick up in the fall after the election wraps up. But in the spring, we are going to do walking tours in the different neighborhoods, kind of showing what exists already. So we'll be promoting that through our e-update list and also on our website. And in addition to that, we're also going to be doing a number of videos that we'll be sharing on social media. Things like what is the missing middle, what can you do, who lives in multiplexes, really kind of showcasing the depth and breadth of who lives in those types of missing middle housing right now. We know that over 33% of Toronto residents already live in missing middle type of housing, and we want to show that. Want to show how families can be accommodated, how seniors can be accommodated, and the different options that exist and that we need more of for our growing city. I would love to hear if you have any other ideas. We're happy to get your feedback on that. So if you have any additional ideas, please reach out to me. Yeah, I would love to hear from you. So it's 8:34, but there's one last question in the chat saying, can you give us the dates to expect the draft and final multiplex OP amendments and bylaw? So Deanne, Chris, when will the OP go forward to City Council?
Report is going quite yet, but we know we're trying to get it in before the end of this council cycle. So there's just some. They're thinking. I think is right now. Chris, do you have some more information?
I think it's July, Planning and Housing Committee. Yeah.
Okay, great. So that'll be the last regular council meeting before the election break. So July. And again, sign up for our e-updates. We will send out notifications on when reports are going forward, along with the draft OPA or final OPA in this case. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for a great meeting, for all your enthusiasm. We had about, at our peak, we had about 70 participants in the meeting. We're down to 50 now, so I really appreciate everyone staying with us till the very end. Again, for all your great questions, comments, and insights that you shared with our staff team. We will be sharing the feedback with our other colleagues as well. So thank you for all of the value you've added to us, to this process. So take care, everyone. Have a great evening, and we'll see you at our next event. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.